Hello again, everyone, and welcome back to Reddit Aliens. I'm John, and as always, thank you so much for being here. A good topic? Let's do it. What was the most intense experience of your life? Please remember to like, share, and subscribe. Had my tonsils out when I was a kid. I was living with my dad at the time, but one particular night, a couple of days later, I really wanted to take a bath, and my mom had a big tub, so I went one night to stay with her for a few days. The next morning, my throat started bleeding heavily. Well, my stepdad worked second shift, so he was home and drove me to the hospital. Wound up severing a vein before I got there. Was violently vomiting blood. They had to stick a hot iron down my throat to stop the blood. Lost 4 pints total. Had 3 transfusions. Said if I was at my dad's and home alone, I probably wouldn't have made it. Was less than awesome. Having a doctor who assumed someone had spoken to me about it have a glance at my chart when I was in the hospital for low red blood count and says to me, "Well, you have cancer, so that's probably why." No one had said anything to me about cancer. Everyone kept telling me my bone marrow biopsy was inconclusive because of poor quality. That was how I found out. A careless, offhand, well, duh sort of comment. I felt like the floor had disappeared beneath me. The rush of emotions I felt was unlike anything I've felt before or since. I was staying at my ex-girlfriend's place one night a few years back. I'll try to keep this short. I was in an apartment complex and we were lying in front of the TV when all of a sudden these blood-curdling screams came from the floor above us. Not only screams, but also glass breaking. I ran upstairs to see what was going on and saw a guy with a gun breaking down her front door. When he saw me, he pointed the gun at me, so I ducked back into the stairwell and ran back to the apartment to call the cops. I locked our door just in case. As we were waiting for the cops to show up, the screams were coming from outside, downstairs this time. I ran to the balcony. We were on the second floor, and I saw a woman running with the guy giving chase. I ran downstairs to help. I guess there was more fight than flight, and as I came around the corner, he shot her twice right in front of me and turned the gun on himself. He died right there on the sidewalk, and fortunately she survived that terrible effing ordeal. I still think about it every week. TL, DR, guy shot a woman in front of me, then killed himself. My best friend, he was my cousin, may as well have been my brother, got hit by a bus in London whilst listening to music on his iPod a couple of years ago. And the bus driver essentially crushed him to death under the front left wheel by lowering the passenger platform instead of raising it. I was at work and I got a call to get to London ASAP and to see half of his skull caved in and subsequently watch him die was the most intense and harrowing experience of my life. I watched my mother die from the big C years before that, but this was a different level. Yes, I miss you, Dave. His username was Gravy727. Always makes me cry reading through his comments. Edit. If anyone wants to see him, please Google David Wood Farrington. I'll read that part again. Edit. If anyone wants to see him, please Google David Wood Farrington. I grew up in the same village as him, and our moms were sisters. He was essentially my brother, and we were always inseparable. He donated 3 of his organs when he passed to save lives, and his accident occurred on the day after he got his dream job at St. Bart's Hospital in London as a radiographer. He was walking to meet his girlfriend for lunch. We did everything together, and he was a week away from proposing to his girlfriend of 7 years. He's buried next to my mom, so my 2 bestest friends are keeping each other company. He was truly an incredible guy, and I miss him so much. The outpouring of love has been overwhelming. Thank you. I really needed it. Meningitis. Pain so intense you have a moment of panic just before each heartbeat because you know how bad your head will hurt during it. The only time I've experienced fever hallucinations, eyes open, I was in the hospital. Eyes closed, I was somewhere else. Other times, with my eyes closed, I could still see the hospital room, but there was a girl with short hair sitting in a chair watching me. They didn't want to give me a Foley bag for whatever reason, so every time I went to the bathroom, which was a lot with the IV, I would spend the next 5 minutes dry heaving into a cardboard bowl, which in turn did wonders for the headache. When I could finally eat again after 6 days, that hospital turkey sandwich was the most delicious thing. Nurses later told my wife why they didn't think I was going to make it through the first night. On Saturday, I was rafting in grade 5 rapids in New Zealand. We flipped, and I got thrown into a recreational recirculation hole. I was being forced underwater with the power of a river with nowhere to get out. I tumbled around like a washing machine for about 30 seconds. Seemed like a lifetime. Eventually, and luckily, a thrust of water popped me out of the hole and into the next rapid. I got into calmer water, with everyone already safe on the bank watching on in terror, hoping I was all right. My paddle snapped. I swallowed some water, but overall, I lived. Discovering that my quiet and chilled-out 6-day-old baby girl was actually dying and needed emergency open-heart surgery. Her condition had not been picked up, and we were blissfully unaware. I'll always be so grateful to the health visitor who came to see us on day 6 and expressed her concerns. Even then, we were expecting a wasted trip to the hospital. Ended up in the front of an ambulance stopping traffic. She's 2 now, and full of beans. So, I'm a type 1 diabetic. About 6 months ago, I forgot to take my blood sugar levels before going to bed. I woke up 6 hours later, keenly aware something was wrong, but I wasn't quite sure what was wrong. I jumped out of bed and stumbled, literally stumbling to the kitchen, and desperately tried to eat something. By the time I had reached the kitchen, my blood sugar was so low that my consciousness began to recede, and I could feel it fading. I remember trying to make French fries because the pantry was empty, but in my barely conscious state, I put them in the toaster instead of the oven. My last memory before I lost consciousness is being frustrated upon remembering fries do not go in the toaster and trying to pull them out. Thank God it was unplugged. Luckily, I still lived with my parents, who woke up while I was unconscious and found me trying to get ice cream to eat, but being unable to get it or form a sentence. Thankfully, they got my blood sugar up and sat me down on the couch, and I regained consciousness. I still remember the loss of control, though, and it is intensely terrifying, even as a memory. Holding my own intestines was the most intense moment in my life. I'll preface the story by telling you that I am now 25. I was a daredevil as a child and loved being one. I once jumped a shoddy Huffy bike off a pretty large ramp when I was 12 years old. When I landed, the front fork snapped where it passed through the front of the frame. The tire caused the broken fork to bounce up toward my stomach, ripping a 4-inch gash across my stomach. The intensity struck after I landed and momentarily blacked out. When I regained vision, I got up and off the ground via my hands and knees. When I looked down, my lower intestines were hanging outside of my body. I had to cut my hand under the gash to keep them from falling further out. The scariest thing was I was over at my mom's friend's neighbor's house under no supervision, holding my guts. I walked from the neighboring house back to where my mom was before hightailing our asses to the nearest hospital. Called to a reported house fire, a neighbor states they heard screaming and saw smoke and flames. This is farm country at 3 a.m. Captain and I hopped barbed wire fences as we frantically raced to this farmhouse to see what happened. Yep, goats. The farmer simply approached us and said, "Howdy boys, problem?" When asked about the screaming and fire, he said he had a brush pile burning and that my goats needed milking. Learned how closely goats and people sounded the same. Captain shook his head as we talked back to the engine and said to never mention this back at the station. Alright, so this is going to give away way too much personal info for Reddit, but I've got no shame. When I was a young kid, I got spinal meningitis. It damaged my heart and brain in a way that destroyed most of my memory function. I get by pretty well now, I just have to write stuff down and it's annoying. Anyway, I ended up in the hospital for 8 or 9 months because of the stack of complications they were trying to figure out. About half of the time, that I remember, I was in ICU, and half was in a room with 4 other kids in beds. Amazingly enough, that alone isn't the most intense part. The kid in the bed next to mine came in because he and his brother were walking around being kids, and his brother was clumsy and smacked him in the neck with a baseball bat and collapsed his trachea. He'd been there a week, wasn't talking much, obviously, but he developed a cough. So, as an aside, the day doctors and nurses were phenomenal, cool people. The night staff was bad. I remember being 8 and thinking, these people are mean, lazy, and worthless. So it's nighttime, and the kid starts coughing. He rings his bell to ask for water, and the nurse comes in, obviously grumpy, with a pitcher and a cup, and just leaves it on his tray. Doesn't say a word. The kid tries to fill the cup and ends up coughing more and spilling the pitcher all over his bed. He rings the nurse again multiple times, and she finally comes in several minutes later and takes everything, all of his bedding and the pitcher and cup. So the kid is lying there on a bare mattress, coughing harder and colder. One of the other kids and I took the sheets from our beds and wrapped him up. He was crying and cold. Half an hour later, the nurse was still gone, and the kid's cough was worse and kind of rattly. At this point, my memory gets foggy, and I think I fell asleep, but I woke up to one of the other kids in his bed screaming. I look over, and the kid is gasping and frantically pushing his call button. We all started screaming and doing the same thing while this kid is making the most god-awful gurgling sounds and starting to turn blue. Finally, the nurse comes running in, smelling overwhelmingly like cigarettes, and screams. She goes running out of the room. A few seconds later, the room is full of yelling and medical staff. They pull his curtain around his bed, and after a few minutes, end up wheeling him out really slowly. Whoever was this nurse's immediate supervisor, we hear bluntly later on yelling at her, "You ignored your station to have a smoke and didn't get a replacement? You let a kid die." Turns out, his tracheal wall collapsed from the force of the coughing, and we all sat there and listened to a 7-year-old kid suffocate on his own throat and die. So that was pretty intense. As a parent, this story really upset me. I know I sometimes give personal tidbits. For this one, I'll defer, but my daughter has had some stuff go on, and she's good. But it's impossible to read these stories and not think of your own children. And it's terrible. My friend was accidentally roofied when his friend gave him a drink another man had given him. That was his second and last drink of the night. I took him home shortly after. He became belligerent and unintelligible during the 10-minute cab ride. He was unable to walk to his door or even stand. He was a mess, in and out of consciousness, crying, begging me to let him sleep. I called 911 because I was very concerned. Mid-phone call, he begins to seize and foam at the mouth. I had to give him CPR twice. Ambulances finally came. I could not wrap my head around what had happened. I even asked EMT, "Do I seem drunk to you?" Because we drank the same amount, and I feel pretty sober. They had to defibrillate him to stabilize his heart on the way to the hospital. The ER doctor said he had rofinol in his system and that he probably would have died if I had let him sleep it off. The next morning, my friend said the last thing he remembered was dancing at the gay bar drinking his drink. Almost lost my best friend. My second year of college, I was 20. I came home from class to find my roommate passed out on the floor with an empty bottle of prescription pills next to him. He had been depressed due to some serious family issues, but I never thought it would come to suicide. I had never dealt with anything like this and was 3,000 miles away from any of my family or friends, and his mom was 6,000 miles away. His dad lived nearby, but he was the cause of the depression, so I was panicked. I have no idea what to do in this situation. I tried to get him up, and he started to stir a little bit, which was great, but he was completely non-functional. I called my dad, who immediately calmed me down and told me I needed to call 911. I thought I might be able to get him down to my car to drive him to the hospital. I was afraid the ambulance would cost too much money for his family. Luckily, my dad made me realize I was being irrational, and I called the ambulance and then informed his mom, who made the situation so much worse. They pumped his stomach, and he was released from the hospital a few days later. His dad came to be with him and took me home later in the evening. It was such an awful car ride. My friend attempted suicide 2 more times, and each time I was the one who found him and called the ambulance. It was a really rough couple of months that forced me to leave college and move back home to finish out school near my family. I'm happy to report my friend is fine now and doing really well in all aspects of life, but it was nearly scary for a while. I don't know how I managed to keep my head about me for the most part. I've had some pretty intense experiences, but one comes to mind pretty quickly. I was about 19 years old, and my dad and I were caught in a giant riptide. I'm a strong swimmer. I was confident in my father. It was us and about 20 other people, while there were only about 5 lifeguards. Everyone was being pulled out to sea pretty rapidly. Some were calm, and others were freaking out. I looked to my left and saw a boy about 9 years old maybe who was freaking out and couldn't keep his composure. I swam towards him and started calming him down, saying, "Don't worry, bud, it won't last forever. Just save your energy and don't fight it. The lifeguards will be here. Lie on your back and try to float." While he was crying, I swam to him and put my hands under his back, and he started floating. I maneuvered us horizontally, and then a lifeguard came and took him away. I got to shore about 30 seconds later, and he was crying while his mom was yelling at him, telling him things like, "Why didn't you listen to me? You can't swim that far away." I went up to the mom, and I was going to give him a high five and tell him that he did a great job of keeping calm. As I started talking, the mother looked at me, scolded me, and looked me head to toe, grabbed his hand, and walked away. My 2-year-old daughter was limping with a fever on a Sunday, so I took her to urgent care clinic. In the first hour of getting there, she falls unconscious and her fever spikes to 103. They give her some pain meds. She wakes up and the urgent care clinic tells me she needs to be transported by ambulance to the children's hospital, but they won't transport her without an IV. At this point, her heart rate had stayed above over 180 to 190 for an hour. They attempted to do an IV 3 times, and each time they were unsuccessful, her heart rate skyrockets. My 2-year-old is beyond upset at this point. She has a fever, she's sick, and they began poking her. The staff goes in for a 4th attempt. This was the most intense moment of my life. My child is being held down and screaming for all she is worth. One nurse on her left side is trying for an IV, and the other nurse on her right side is watching the heart monitor. The monitor reads 238 beats per minute. The nurse monitoring the heart rate tells the other nurse to stop, or she'll die. Worst words to say in front of a parent. The other nurse replied, "If I don't get an IV in, she'll die in transport." Even worse words. I was terrified my daughter was going to die. She ended up having an ear infection with nothing more wrong with her. Terrible experience, and several $1,000 bill. At a barbecue down by the river, my 4-year-old nephew disappeared. There were about 10 adults around, and none of us saw him go. We were in the middle of a large grass reserve, a river on one side, a wetland bird sanctuary on the other, and we were all panicked. After about 15 minutes of searching with no luck, we called the cops, hoping they could help us find him. It took them half an hour to get there, and by this time we were all frantic, but none more so than my sister. She was wading through the water, screaming his name over and over. His name is Will, and I tell you, Stranger Things gave me flashbacks. I've never been so heartbroken in my life. I was just beginning to realize that he had probably drowned and I'd never see him again when we looked up and saw my husband walking across the grass, my nephew holding his hand. There was a playground that every one of us had searched twice, but he somehow found his way there. To this day, we have no idea how he snuck away and where he was for those 45 minutes. We all got very drunk that night.